President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump have tested positive for the CCP virus. We'll be explaining what happened. Also, a prominent advisor to the CCP has declared that democracy and freedom are poisons and cults that conflict with the government. I'll be explaining this. And also on the Three Gorges Dam, it's now been revealed there are 3 nuclear power plants around the dam, which could pose a significant threat to the country. We'll be going in depth into this. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump have tested positive for the CCP virus. Trump made the announcement on Twitter close to 1 a.m. on October 2nd, stating that, quote, "Tonight, Flotus and I tested positive for COVID-19. We will begin our quarantine and recovery process immediately. We will get through this together." Just prior to this announcement, it had also been announced that Trump and Melania had been placed in quarantine after White House aide Hope Hicks tested positive for the virus. Trump said both of them are now doing well, and he expects to continue working as he recovers. Vice President Mike Pence and Second Lady Karen Pence were also tested, but they showed up negative for the virus. And with this, just following the September 29th debates, Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden may get tested as well. CNN wrote that Biden was expected to get tested on the morning of October 2nd and cited a source allegedly familiar with his plans. Also, just before Trump made the announcement, the U.S. Navy launched 2 of its E-6B Mercury planes from both American coasts. The planes function as airborne nuclear command posts and have special equipment to communicate with the Navy's Ohio-class submarines, which carry nuclear ballistic missiles. Forbes reports that the Navy has around 16 of these planes, and it's not technically uncommon to have 2 of them in the air simultaneously, but the timing of their deployment does seem relevant. It's very possible, for example, the U.S. wants to dissuade other countries from possibly even thinking about trying to attack the U.S. while Trump and Melania are, for example, in quarantine. Also, the Chinese Communist Party appears to be chiming in on Trump being diagnosed with the virus, and they're viewing it, it seems, based on statements, in terms of U.S.-China conflicts. Now, Hu Xijin, editor-in-chief of the state-run Global Times, wrote on Twitter, quote, "President Trump and the First Lady have paid the price for his gamble to play down the COVID-19. The news shows the severity of the U.S.'s pandemic situation. It will impose a negative impact on the image of Trump and the U.S., and may also negatively affect his re-election." Now, the Chinese Communist Party on this is trying to blame the U.S. for example, covering up the virus. This is what they do. It's called projection. You accuse others of what you yourself have done. You accuse others of what you yourself did. The Chinese Communist Party builds this into one of its own main tactics. Anything it does, it says other people have done. Anything it's accused of, it accuses other people of doing. The Chinese Communist Party is being accused, for example, of playing down the virus, of misleading the world about the virus. And now you see the head of the Global Times accusing Trump of doing that instead. And as the CCP again is facing new lockdowns, they're saying the virus is spreading in the U.S. and playing up the image of it in the U.S. This is again a tactic of the CCP. And again, with this being a state-run news outlet, the Chinese Communist Party is demonstrating its position. He again said President Trump and the First Lady have paid the price for his gamble to play down the COVID-19. The Chinese Communist Party appears again to be viewing this in terms of U.S.-China conflicts. The CCP again appears to be viewing this as something they are celebrating, something they see as positive. And meanwhile, with the U.S. elections, Republicans are pushing back in several U.S. states against Democrat changes to voting laws that they say are unfair and could cause chaos in the upcoming elections. In Pennsylvania, which is a key swing state, they asked the Supreme Court to block a ruling that would extend the November 3rd deadline to receive mail-in ballots. The Pennsylvania High Court, which has a 5-2 Democrat majority, has refused to put the ruling on hold as Republicans bring the case to the Supreme Court. And as this happens, some Democrat Party leaders appear to be backing off of the idea of mail-in ballots. Now, what are we seeing here? Now, the push for mail-in ballots has mainly been pushed by Democrats. For the most part, a lot of Republicans have been against the idea. Republicans have alleged that it could cause, for example, voter fraud. But there are additional concerns with mail-in ballots in addition to that. Now, besides the allegations of potential voter fraud, mail-in and absentee ballots do have very real issues associated with them. In the 2020 primaries, for example, around 550,000 of them were disqualified. They're a lot more sensitive when it comes to receiving these ballots. If there are small issues, for example, signatures don't seem to line up, they can be rejected. Now, the Democrats have been pushing for more of the, say, mail-in ballot approach with the coming elections, based on the idea that maybe voting at the polls is dangerous with the CCP virus going around. That's their allegation. Republicans, on the other hand, have alleged they believe that this is a voter fraud, them trying to rig the elections and so on. Can't necessarily prove it, that's the allegation. But there are some very real issues, again, with these mail-in ballots. If, for example, it happens that Democrats choose to vote more by mail, Republicans tend to vote more by in-person because Republicans are more concerned about the security of the election. Then what does that mean if, for example, ballots received after November 3rd are not accepted? Well, it means two things. One is very likely that's going to be more of the Democrat votes. And number two, it also very likely means that the, say, decision on who is going to lead the country will be delayed. And there are some very serious issues with that as well, which we'll be explaining in a bit. On that note, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat from California, told reporters on October 1st that she's preparing the House for a potential role in determining the winner of the upcoming presidential elections with a vote by state delegation. She noted that if neither candidate has a majority, something very important would happen. She said, quote, "Then it goes into another range where the Speaker becomes the President." That would be her as Speaker of the House. Now again, this raises questions about the integrity of mail-in ballots during this time. If, for example, the mail-in ballots cause a constitutional crisis where it's not clear who actually won the elections. If, for example, they say that, well, because of issues with the post office, problems being caused by the virus, of course, mail's been a lot slower during this time. What does that mean, for example, if the ballots are not reliable? If so many votes are held back that they're not fully counted? Well, that could cause an issue with the elections where the integrity of the election is called into question. If that happens, it goes to the Supreme Court to make the decision in terms of deciding how to go forward. Now, when it comes to the vote on that, there's the tie-breaking vote. There are 9 Supreme Court justices at this time, but with Ruth Bader Ginsburg having recently passed away, there's no longer a tie-breaking vote, meaning that it could be stuck in limbo in the Supreme Court. And as Nancy Pelosi mentioned, that could mean that she becomes a de facto president of the United States. Now, will that happen? Very unlikely. It does seem the Republicans, for example, do have the votes to approve their own new Supreme Court justice, meaning that this whole plan now, if that were to be the case, would not really come to fruition. That would not really happen. Very likely, if it was contested, the Supreme Court would lean in favor of Trump, based on the, say, partisan divide within the Supreme Court. Again, we'll have to see how this unfolds. Meanwhile, a bill introduced by House Republicans would restrict U.S. investment in companies connected to the Chinese Communist Party. And depending on the scope of how they define if a company is connected to the Chinese Communist Party, this could include nearly every Chinese company. Remember, we talked about previously on this show, the Chinese Communist Party, as we speak, is launching a new program that will create mixed ownership, a new mixed ownership model of businesses. Meaning, for example, that being a small business in China no longer means you're independent of the Chinese Communist Party. They have a mixed ownership model that means government and private together. If the Chinese Communist Party is doing this model of mixed ownership and say, for example, U.S. companies are restricted from working with Chinese companies tied to the CCP, this means that just about every single Chinese company would fall under that designation. And alongside this, new research done by Dutch consulting firm Datena BVT has found that Chinese government shareholders have unseen influence in hundreds of deals in Europe, around 40% they found. Wall Street Journal reports that of 650 Chinese investments since 2010 that were analyzed, again, about 40% have a high to moderate level of involvement from Chinese state-owned companies. And again, we'll have to see what the scope is when it comes to this new bill that will ban U.S. companies from working with Chinese companies if they're connected to the CCP. If it's on the higher level, when it comes to direct state-owned companies of the CCP working with, say, investment and so on, about 40% based on this analysis would fall under that designation. And in some related news to this, U.S. Representative Scott Perry has also introduced legislation. This one would add the Chinese Communist Party to the top international criminal organizations target list and direct U.S. law enforcement agencies to target the CCP's malign activities, such as intellectual property theft and its trafficking of illegal drugs such as fentanyl. Representative Perry said in a statement, quote, "For decades, the aggressive, illegal behavior of the CCP has cost Americans millions of jobs, billions of dollars in intellectual property value, and the independence of our academic institutions." Some other news when it comes to human rights. People fleeing Hong Kong may now be recognized for the first time by the United States as refugees. The State Department has listed Hong Kong on its proposed refugee resettlement program. It states that Trump's proposal for refugee resettlement in fiscal year 2021, quote, reaffirms America's enduring commitment to assist the world's most vulnerable people while fulfilling our first duty to protect and serve the American people. Now keep in mind the context of this. The Chinese Communist Party, with its new national security laws, has essentially ended Hong Kong's autonomy from the CCP. Hong Kong used to be mostly democratic, with most of the same protections that free countries enjoy. That has now changed. People have tried fleeing Hong Kong now, including going to, for example, Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party has even arrested people trying to flee Hong Kong to other countries. Now, going forward, we'll have to see whether this is passed when it comes to, again, fiscal year 2021 and the U.S. recognition of Hong Kongers as refugees. But if that does happen, very likely Britain is going to follow suit, and possibly other countries are going to follow suit as well. In addition to this, human rights organizations are now coming together to call out the Chinese Communist Party. As the CCP celebrated its 71 years of rule on October 1st, a global coalition of more than 150 human rights groups from close to 60 cities around the world rallied against the CCP. NTD reported the persecuted groups included a mix of Tibetans, Hong Kongers, Taiwanese, ethnic Mongolians, Uyghur Muslims, Kazakhs, and other exiled Chinese dissidents. Meanwhile, a prominent advisor to the CCP has declared that democracy and freedom are poisons and cults that conflict with the CCP's rule. Jin Canrong, whose titles include an advisory of policy planning office of the CCP's National People's Congress, said in a video speech that, quote, democracy is poison and cult. Now, for the CCP, the word cult, these are political labels. They use them politically. The CCP and other communist regimes call these power words. How do you take normal words that have, say, negative or positive connotations and alter their meanings, alter their use to serve for a radical revolutionary use? Now, again, cult is one of the power words of the CCP. It uses this label to go against groups it persecutes. Falun Gong, for example. Now, a lot of Western media have repeated that label. What they don't know is the CCP uses that label for most other religions. And they also use that label when criticizing democracy. They call democracy a cult. This is a political label. It's what they call a power word. Now, the CCP, going back, used this tactic very often. During the Cultural Revolution, for example, the word mi-shin, which means superstition, was used also as a political weapon. It was used in traditional China, for example. This would be blind belief, trust in your teacher, trust in your government, trust in other people. They're willing to believe people who are teaching you right from wrong, and so on. By altering that word, the Chinese Communist Party created a political weapon. The word itself became a political weapon that it could use in one statement to defame a political enemy. It used that term to launch its persecutions against Christianity, Buddhism, Taoism, Catholicism, and so on. It used that word, for example, to persecute intellectuals, to persecute teachers. These are political tools, the alteration of the meaning of a well-accepted term in order to use it again to persecute dissidents, to persecute ideologies, and to persecute otherwise legitimate systems. And now for the broader stories for today. Now, first up, on the note of the Three Gorges Dam, we've been monitoring the situation. There have been some updates on it, but we're trying to confirm them. Right now, there's a lot of things in the realm of rumor we're trying to confirm before we present them here. But one interesting thing that has come up is the issue of nuclear power plants in the Yangtze River Basin. Now, a lot of the arguments on this go back to August 24th. Guo Wengui broke the news in a live broadcast that there are 3 nuclear plants around the Three Gorges Dam. If the dam were to break, these nuclear plants may cause a huge disaster. Now, the issue of safety on nuclear power plants in mainland China has long been raised by experts. But mainland media has frequently misled the public by propagating these so-called, quote, low probability of accidents at nuclear power plants. Now, you might remember we reported on this. The Chinese Communist Party was holding drills to prepare people for nuclear fallout. This was not because they believed China was going to face nuclear attack, but because they believe any airstrikes against China, if a conflict were to break out, may cause nuclear fallout because they have so many nuclear power plants. Any airstrike on China, any military attack on China, very likely would become a nuclear disaster. again, because they have so many of them. And so the question is, again, why were they preparing the Chinese people for nuclear fallout? Why were they holding these drills in China? Was it because they really believed another country would attack them? Or was it because they believed the natural disasters across China may impact the nuclear power plants that it has? Now, you might remember Fukushima in Japan when this nuclear power plant was damaged by the tsunamis. It cracked part of it. They had a leak. This caused a nuclear disaster. This brings back memories also of Chernobyl. Fukushima was called the Chernobyl of Japan. What would happen in China with these big floods all across China if the dam were to break, for example, with these different disasters it's facing? What happens to its different nuclear plants across the country? It's facing many types of natural disasters right now, earthquakes, floods, you name it. The Chinese Communist Party does appear to be preparing for a disaster of this kind. And for China, again, this would not be a small disaster because the Chinese Communist Party is not like Japan. The Chinese Communist Party is a lot more like the Soviet Union. This would not be a Fukushima for the CCP. This would be a Chernobyl for the CCP. Now, in some U.S. news, when it comes to healthcare in the United States, the policy of President Donald Trump is to reduce the cost of medicine in order to make healthcare more accessible. He said during the September 29th presidential debates for 2020 with Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden that he's cutting drug prices, going against Big Pharma, and then when it comes to repealing Obamacare, he got rid of the individual mandate that had forced people to pay into it. Now, when it comes to Biden's policy on healthcare, Biden said that he plans to bring back Obamacare. He wants to revitalize Obamacare. And he criticized Donald Trump of wanting to get rid of that, which would cut the healthcare plan of a lot of Americans who still use Obamacare. Trump clarified that his stance is to get rid of Obamacare. And he believes that by doing so, not only will he get rid of this mandatory system where you're forced to pay into it, he did get rid of the individual mandate on it, but he also wants to try to reduce the cost of healthcare overall. Now, this isn't really well explained in a lot of areas. The high cost of drugs, the high cost of medicine in the United States has been one of the underlying issues with the high cost of healthcare. And both issues stem from an already flawed system tied to the way the U.S. government policy impacts the cost of healthcare and medicine. Now, while Obamacare sought to subsidize healthcare through mandatory fees, the system didn't address the factors that make medical care unaffordable in the first place. This is what Trump is focused on. Now, while former President Barack Obama had promised taxpayers that if they liked their healthcare plans, they could keep their plans, it had an opposite effect for many. It caused many health insurance plans to turn unprofitable and to shutter operations. That left people with only a handful of choices in high-cost insurance plans. It raised the overall cost of insurance to the extent that many people who are not eligible for the free part of Obamacare have to pay a whole lot more for health care. Now, when it comes to the insurance companies themselves, the reason why many of them turned unprofitable was mainly because they had to evaluate people's health risks before giving them access to their plans. That normally helps ensure the plans can be profitable. But with Obamacare in place and these different government laws, the math no longer worked out for the health insurance companies. More unhealthy people entered the risk pool, which caused companies to close down, and with fewer insurance plans available, less demand, less supply, plans again began to cater to these same people, and the only plans that remain are the high-cost ones because of this. People who are not eligible for plans or who couldn't afford the cost of Obamacare were left either with paying for the high-cost insurance plan they were left with or paying the Obamacare mandate penalty. A lot of people in the middle income bracket have faced this, and this is at least before Trump ended the individual mandate on Obamacare. Yet beyond all of this, as I briefly mentioned before, there are deeper issues at play behind the high cost of medicine and healthcare in the United States, and Obamacare did nothing to address these underlying issues. Among the problems is that the U.S. medical system, these insurance companies work as the middlemen between patients and providers when it comes to negotiating the cost of medical procedures and drugs. Now, for patients, these negotiations may not result in costs going down for them. Insurance companies don't look at or negotiate at the level of procedures, and healthcare providers increase their costs to insurance companies in ways that don't reflect the natural market. Among Trump's actions around medical care was to address this issue. He passed an executive order, for example, that gives transparency on hospital procedures, and this sheds light for consumers on the high costs that get tacked onto healthcare for patients. This gives patients the ability to shop around for services because they can see how much additional money is being tacked on top of the baseline costs. And this brings in free market principles that would give healthcare providers incentives to reduce their costs in order to stay competitive in the market. Now, there are other areas of this as well. We'll go into some of this in future episodes. For example, with the high cost of medicine. In a similar way, for example, there are intermediary regulatory bodies that are increasing the cost of medicine. There are arguments for it. There are a lot more arguments against it. We'll be going in depth into that as well. But moving on with this topic, reducing the costs. This is the focus of the Trump administration as opposed to subsidizing them. Now, Obamacare forcefully subsidized them. It said every American has to pay this whether you like it or not, and if you refuse to buy into it, you have to pay a very expensive penalty. Now, Trump got rid of the penalty on that, meaning it's no longer being subsidized in that way. You're not punished individually if you refuse to pay into it. But it still means, again, because of the way it put different insurance companies out of business and the way that it got rid of the lower cost plans on insurance, that many middle-income Americans either can't afford Obamacare or are forced to pay a whole lot of money for one of the expensive plans. Now, Trump's plan, again, his strategy, which is not very well explained a lot of times, is reducing the costs. In other words, if we were to pay into it, if you were forced to pay, for example, for the health insurance industry, the healthcare industry, and the medical industry, they can charge whatever they want. This is one of the reasons why big corporations tend to support government policies on these things. Why they ironically tend to support socialist policies is because this makes taxpayers subsidize high costs of operations. If the government is subsidizing it, individual private companies can increase costs as much as they want, and people have to pay it, whether you like it or not. Again, the prices are being set by intermediary laws, intermediary institutions that are making the prices go up. Unless that is addressed, taxpayers are going to be forced, whether you like it or not, to subsidize these industries, to subsidize the high cost of care, to subsidize, again, these medical practices and business practices that make things a whole lot more expensive than they should be. The focus again with Trump is to reduce this, to get rid of these policies, to get rid of these systems that are increasing the costs, to make the cost of drugs in America similar to it is in most other countries. This is his focus. Now that said, folks, we're again broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, and also with a live Q&A every Sunday. If you want to join us 10:30 Eastern Time, p.m. Also, if you want to support us, please consider joining us on Patreon. You can find the link to our Patreon page in the description below. If you haven't already, also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel. And if you want to go the extra miles, I always mention, please tell a friend or family member about Crossroads, and please consider sharing this video. Now, that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.